My name is Jonathan Kaplan. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our lecture for this evening, Are Orientals, in quotes, a race or a nationality? Immigration restriction of Asians and Jews in the early 20th century, which will be given today by Professor Madeline Xu, who is a professor in the Department of History, faculty affiliate with the Center for Asian American Studies, where she was formerly the director for 8 years, and also, I believe, the Center for Mexican American Studies as well. She's also been president of the Immigration and Ethnic History Society, and is presently representative at large for the International Society for the Study of China Overseas. A native of Columbia, Missouri, she grew up in Taiwan and Hong Kong, and this is what I think is also fascinating is frequent visits to her grandparents at their store in Altheimer, Arkansas. So a very, very childhood experience. She's an undergraduate history degree from Pomona College and a PhD from Yale University. She is an author of numerous books, including her first book, Dreaming of Gold, Dreaming of Home, Transnationalism and Migration Between the US and South China. And then more recently, Asian American History, a very short introduction, published in 2016 by Oxford University Press, and is finished a co-edited anthology, A Nation of Immigrants Reconsidered, and is in 2019, and is currently finishing up a co-edited, I think it's a Cambridge history, you said, of immigration. So we're delighted to have Professor Xu here today to share with us on this topic. So please join me in welcoming.
Thank you, Jonathan and Tatiana, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to give this talk. It's going to be sort of informal, and I'll rely a lot on my PowerPoint, which is here. And so let me just get it set up a bit. Okay. Let's see, can you see it okay? Yes, you
yes,
can see it okay?
It's coming through.
Yes. All right, let's see. I'm going to try to also set this up so that I can see the Zoom room more. So this is just going to walk us through sort of the early decades of immigration regulation in the United States. And I think really try to illustrate some of the challenges and the priorities that intersect at this very important matter, which of course is currently very, very fraught in this country. And I hope maybe this talk will help.
Let me interrupt you for a second. I think you're showing the presenter view rather than the slideshow view. So
okay, so how do I fix that?
You can unshare and then just reshare so that you're sharing the screen, which has the slideshow itself instead of the presenter view.
Oh, okay, so stop share. And then what do I do?
Select share again and then reshare with the screen that should be the actual visual view of the slideshow.
Okay, let's see. Let's try this. Is that working?
Let's see, it's just starting. It's still the presenter view. You might click on the button that says display settings at the top of your screen.
Okay,
there,
display settings, yes.
And then pull that down.
Ah, okay, there. That working?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, all right. So this is just, you know, this slide you're looking at should just be sort of my publications. Okay, so I wanted to start the talk with just sort of our contemporary immigration regulation policies. And so this is a sort of a humorous but also quite serious representation of current policy and the main avenues for legal immigration into the United States, right? And so it presents it from the perspective of somebody who is aspiring to immigrate into the United States. And presently, and this draws back to the 1965 Immigration Act, there are three main criterion which gain you legal entry. One is through family relationships, and they have to be fairly close family relationships, or through employment, and this is restricted to forms of employment. You have to have an employer who's willing to process the paperwork, and you have to be fulfilling a form of labor identified by the Department of Labor as being needed in the United States. Some people here, I think, will have experienced this. There also is a refugee pathway that's very, very narrow, and it's subject to actually a lot of screening. And so these are the three main considerations, right, that you need to be able to fulfill in order to immigrate currently. Now, I show you this just to help you start thinking about immigration regulation. And although a lot of times we talk about immigration restriction, I prefer the term regulation because it helps us to sort of have a more capacious understanding that immigration policy is not only about keeping out certain identified targets and categories of unwanted persons, there's also a selective process of whom we admit, right? And so the current immigration regulation framework focuses on whom we admit. Now, one of the things to consider as we look at this graphic, and I will move us criteria is, one, immigrate who wants to, who in fact has, okay, my internet connection is unstable, so I'm going to just turn off my camera. Hopefully that will stabilize it. Okay, but so,
Madeline, are you advancing your slides?
and also,
there's been
yes,
some
I did
concern.
advance my, so it's a,
Yeah.
is it at the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration Act?
No, we're still seeing just your slides of your books.
Oh, really? Oh, okay, that's not good. Huh.
No, it's not.
It's not advancing. It's not advancing?
Not advancing.
Okay. Huh.
I wonder if you should share your Firefox, your desktop, share your desktop instead of the PowerPoint. And then you can put the PowerPoint up so you can see it better.
Okay, let me start my video and let me, okay. New share. Let's see. Okay, let's try screen 2. All right. Can you see it? Oh, wait. Is this working?
That's working perfectly. Yeah,
Okay, so this is what part of legal immigration don't you understand?
that's what we're seeing. Yes.
Okay, all right, good, good. Okay, and hopefully this will work. All right, so this is what I was just talking about, right? And this depicts, but is reasonably accurate, right? In terms of the legal pathways for immigration. And I show you this in part because it should be largely familiar, but also because legally speaking, it performs, and also symbolically, it performs a kind of a sleight of hand, right? In which our attention is really focused on who can be admitted, right? As opposed to who is being restricted, who is being prevented, in fact, has no legal pathway for immigration to the United States, which in fact constitutes actually a significant majority of the people in the world, right? And so it's with the 1965 Immigration Act that we have this kind of shift, and it represents, U.S. Congress, the U.S. federal authorities sort of gaining some more sophistication in immigration policy, because immigration policy is inherently discriminatory. It is in fact highly and deeply discriminatory because it sort of carves out significant forms of difference and unequal treatment, especially for the kinds of people who are identified as not being welcome, as being unable to immigrate legally into the United States, and to become US citizens. Does this, I hope this makes sense. It should also, for most of the US's history of sort of active enforcement of immigration regulation, unfortunately, the primary criteria emphasized in immigration policy was the people who were being kept out, and the chief criteria used to determine who could be immigrants or who could not actually focused on race and national origin. So highly discriminatory, highly sort of actively offensive to the peoples being identified for immigration restriction. And so this is sort of the intersection at which I'm talking about immigration policy towards Asians and then also towards Jews, because so the kind of the foundations of US immigration policy actually rely tremendously on the racist campaigns targeting first Chinese and then other Asians as being unsuitable to immigrate into the United States, right? And so this is a political cartoon. I think this one dates to maybe 1879, 1880. The United States is going, there have been certain sort of political and economic shifts which make immigration regulation sort of a driving force in national politics, including the importance of California in a swing state, as a swing state. And so California at this time, which was the state with the most Chinese, really prioritized restricting Chinese immigration, right? And so on the heels of this, Chinese restriction becomes a national movement, a national campaign. And thus you have political cartoons such as this one showing up in Harper's Illustrated. This one is was put together by Thomas Nast, who actually has a pretty balanced point of view, but it does ask the question, right? Whether or not the United States can justify making this major turn in sort of national policy and values and history and start actively, intentionally restricting immigration of select groups. But here, of course, there are certain sort of powerful reasons to do so. One is the racialization of Chinese as different, right, and inferior, as non-assimilating. You have here in the middle of the political cartoon, you have the figure of Columbia, who represents the ideal of the American Republic. And, you know, and she is standing up for this ideal and asking the question, hands off, gentlemen, America means fair play for all men. And even as she is defending the equality for a figure who can't even stand up for himself, right? And he's clearly not adapting to life in the United States. He retains his hairstyle, he retains his clothing. He's not standing up for himself. You can sort of see his facial features. He doesn't look really human, right? And they're standing against a wall listing all of the reasons why Chinese, in fact, are different. And they, in fact, are dangerous in the United States. They are barbarians. They are non-Christians. They're associated with being coolie workers who were seen as threats to white American working class men, akin to slavery, right? And at this juncture, the United States has just gone through the Civil War, has sort of very, very difficult process of getting rid of the system of slavery. And so the question is asked about whether Chinese can actually should be allowed to continue coming into the United States. This also is contextualized against the group to which Columbia is speaking, which is a mob of armed, violent men, right? So the leaders of the anti-Chinese movement, many of them were Irish Americans, themselves new immigrants, but associated very much with sort of disorder, just upheaval, as evoked in the back. And you can see the tree with the noose evoking lynching, we can see this building that is burning, the colored orphanage, evoking the draft riots in 1863 in New York. And this is a reminder that the United States has a terrible history of race relations. It's violent, it's unresolved, it's unsettled. And the question is being asked whether the United States has the capacity, in fact, to be a multiracial democracy. And at this juncture, the decision is no, right? And there actually will be a fair level of consensus about this. So here we have another political cartoon representing sort of of unchecked Chinese migration. You have all these steamship companies that are profiting, Chinese landing in sort of endless numbers in San Francisco and in Vancouver, sort of taking over San Francisco Chinatown. So I mean, they're very hardworking, very industrious, establishing all of these businesses, right? Representing a challenge to American civilization on the newly established state of California on the West Coast. And so here we have the hissing cat of public opinion, right? And so there is this pressure and these moves. And in 1876, actually, there's already a fair degree of consensus. And we have the construction of the American Wall, being put together by a lineup of ethnic stereotypes led by this Irish fellow here, laws against race, jealousy, prejudice, but very importantly, being put together by congressional mortar, right? So Congress is the entity that has to enact immigration policy. And so congressional mortar holds the whole thing together, even as we have this image of Chinese dismantling the Great Wall, right? And just waiting to come over, but they will be blocked. Now, so this is Chinese will be identified by race, right? And so key parameters of US immigration regulation, but then also restrictions around citizenship will be based on this presumption of racial difference and incompatibility and non-assimilability, right? And so the Chinese Exclusion Act, passed in 1882, identifies Chinese by race. And so Chinese will be the only race of people identified in immigration laws for restriction, right? But there is even older precedent for having race be the primary category. If we go all the way back to the 1790 Nationality Act, this is the first US sort of legislation regarding the process of naturalization, who can become a citizen, how you become a citizen of the United States after immigrating, right? One of the key restrictions was that naturalization was limited to, quote, free white persons. In practice, only white male property owners could gain citizenship by naturalization, right? And in 1790, you can sort of see who the members of Congress were, right? And they passed a law saying, well, people like us can become citizens of our new country, right? But this law, this racial restriction around citizenship is not fully set aside until 1952. Right? So for most of US history, there's a racial restriction on citizenship. It produces this legal category of aliens ineligible for citizenship, which meant Asian immigrants, right? And so there's this sort of powerful barrier. And so when we get to 1882, various Chinese have already applied, and it's become established in law that no, they cannot get citizenship, right? On the basis of their race. Chinese exclusion law identifies them by race. And you will have a sort of after the passage of the Chinese exclusion law, you will have more and more immigration regulations being passed, restrictions being passed, targeting a broadening range of undesirable attributes and traits of immigrants, right? And so so here we will have this 1882 Immigration Act passed later that year, targeting persons likely to become public charges, which means basically poor people, convicts, and lunatics. You will have basically all Asians will become subject to these severe immigration restrictions, right? And so the Chinese will be identified by race, other groups will be identified by nationality and by geography. And so this, hence the title of my talk, which is actually, it's actually a little bit problematic, but to think about how you, when you are thinking about something as severely discriminatory as immigration laws, how you actually come to agreement about the attributes and the qualities of persons. What is it about the persons that disqualify them from immigration? And then once, if you come to some sort of agreement about that, how do you then actually put that into laws, right? And so we have what has come to be known in Asian American studies as Asian exclusion. So here we see in 1904, there's a permanent enactment of the Chinese exclusion laws, and then swiftly attention turns to Japanese, right? And so Japanese exclusion is not so readily accomplished, however, because Japan is a rising international power. Whereas, so the United States passes the anti-Chinese laws, the Chinese government tries to protest, tries to negotiate for better terms, and the United States government realizes, oh, we can just ignore them. We can just set it aside. We can sort of pass more and more restrictive conditions, have enforcement measures that are sort of, again, target Chinese for what, if it didn't have to do with immigration, would be actually considered unconstitutional, right? And so one of the enforcement measures was this requirement passed in 1892 that Chinese had to carry documentation proving their legal immigration. So only Chinese were required to carry around these documents, a certificate of residence to show that they had entered legally. If they did not have the document, they could be detained and they could be deported, right? And Chinese challenge all of this every step of the way in court, right? And they have good basis to believe. They've hired attorneys. They challenged this requirement of a certificate of residence as surely unconstitutional and a violation of the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment, and they lose at the level of the Supreme Court, right? Across the 1890s into the early 1900s, Chinese keep trying to protest all of these immigration restriction laws and enforcement measures that are enacted against them, and they keep losing. And so there is sort of, and what the Supreme Court is upholding is the sovereign and plenary powers of the federal government over immigration regulation and enforcement, right? And these sorts of powers and extreme authority continue into our present. Okay, so now Japanese start coming in greater numbers starting in the 1880s. They fill many of the same economic niches as Chinese. Many go into agriculture, many go into construction, many of them go into business. Japanese government and the Japanese empire is sort of very attentive to what has been happening to Chinese and is eager to avoid being racialized in the same way, right? And so many Japanese Americans, in fact, are encouraged to go into farming, to develop their own independent farms in emulation of sort of classic immigrant narratives of Europeans, right, that are so celebrated. It doesn't work, right? They continue to be racialized as yellow peril. Sort of their tremendous success actually in California agriculture is sort of portrayed as this form of invasion and takeover. And so the restrictions on Japanese are pursued, but are produced out of a negotiated diplomatic agreement. The 1907-1908 Gentleman's Agreement. The Japanese government is really concerned not to be identified as inferior by being targeted for US immigration restrictions, for US laws. And so what the Japanese government does is it says, we will self-restrict. We will stop the unwanted Japanese laborers from coming to the United States. we will manage the situation. We acknowledge the United States is perfectly legitimate in having its preferences. And so we will ensure that the unwanted kinds of Japanese will not go to the United States, right? And actually the system, in fact, works quite well, although Japanese Americans retain rights for family reunification, right? And so Japanese women continue to be able to come to the United States as picture brides, and so we actually have sort of an emergence of a US born Japanese American population, right? We also have attention turning to other Asians who are immigrating starting at just about the turn of the 20th century, including Koreans are covered by the Japanese agreements because Korea is a colony of Japan. We have Asian Indians coming. We will also have Filipinos, right? But so similar kinds of language and perceptions being applied to Asian Indians. Asian Indians are tricky though, because it's not so easy to categorize them as a race or as a nationality. Because Asian Indians, racially speaking, are Aryans or Caucasian, right? And so it's sort of trickier, but what happens is that Congress will pass in 1917 an Immigration Act, which creates a barred zone, which I'll show you here. So this is the barred zone. This is the actual map taken from the legislation, and it's pretty sweeping. Right. But I think it reflects the general consensus that we just don't want people from Asia. Right. And according to people's racial beliefs at this time, which is that, if you came from a different environment, if you sort of evolved differently, you were a different race, you were incompatible, the races should not mix. And so this was just sort of a sweeping way of putting this into legislation. Right. And it also it's a problematic law for many reasons, but it did have the bonus that it enabled the restriction of migration from India, right? You didn't have to have a debate, a discussion about whether or not Indians were counted as whites or not. Okay, so if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand. Now, this brings us to Jews, right? And so formally, Jewish persons are white, right? Even though in many ways they will be racialized, it's not clear, it's not so readily accepted that they actually count as the sort of assimilable, sort of comparable culture and civilization to the what we could call the old stock of US immigration, often described under the acronym of WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? And so this is where the issues of how you categorize people, how you identify their negative traits, and then how you actually legislate it into law, there are, I think, illuminating comparisons between the Asian and the Jewish experience. Now, so there are key fault lines, right? And so this slide is intended to evoke one of the major ones, which is that as aliens ineligible for citizenship, right? As non-whites, Asians cannot get citizenship, they cannot vote, right? And so as depicted here, they are of no use to either party, right? And so it is easy, in fact, to agree to restrict their entry. It also means that Asian American communities are not in a good position to lobby for and try to advocate on their own behalf. Okay, let's see. Michael Churgan, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? Oh, you're muted.
Just want to emphasize that birthright citizenship permitted Chinese to become citizens if they were born in the United States. So their parents who came in could not become citizen, but if they had children, those children were US citizens.
So yes, so that's a very important point. Sort of the emergence of a US born Chinese generation are delayed, right? Because there's not that many Chinese women who come over. This is pretty different though, if we look at Japanese Americans, right? Because they are in a position to bring over the picture brides, and the birth of the US born Japanese American population actually was really important in the kinds of toeholds that Japanese Americans will be able to carve out. Right, so there will be sort of discriminatory laws regarding things like land ownership on the basis of being an alien ineligible for citizenship, and so Japanese Americans were best able to get around that. But you know, so the gender imbalance among, say, Chinese Americans lasts into the 1970s, right? In part because of these problems. Okay, but so. In terms of advocacy for Asian Americans, right, most of the advocacy will come from homeland governments, right, trying to negotiate with the US federal government. This is in contrast to persons who actually are considered white, are able to get citizenship. So here we have this one, it's actually a critique of Irish and Germans, they're Catholic, they also like drink too much, right? But nonetheless, they are able to get citizenship and become voters, and in this way gain themselves leverage and purchase with various levels of government, right? This is one of the reasons why Irish Americans are able to sort of emerge from the and they face significant levels of hostility and nativism, particularly after the Irish famine and their association with extreme poverty, right? But they actually are able to get organized and claim some strength in terms of various spheres of civic activity, right? And there's also just this reality that even though in the 1880s and 1890s, there is sort of suspicion and hostility, perception of hyphenated Americans who, because of US naturalization laws, are able to gain citizenship and participate politically, although their politics are suspect, right? But for Jewish Americans, they fall on the right side of that racial line. They, in fact, can get citizenship. They can form these lobbying entities. They can try to influence politics, and they can try to influence policy. And this is critical in part because there will be more and more attention directed to the problem of Jewish immigration, particularly in sort of between 1880 and through World War II. And okay, so hopefully this works. Oh, good, this works. Okay, and so I like using this representation of overall immigration because it brings together a lot of information. I wouldn't necessarily look at the bottom half of it, but so we can see overall levels of immigration to the United States by decade. For today's purposes, we are most concerned with sort of the 1880s through the 1920s, and we can see that there are overall peaking levels of general immigration into the United States, right? And in fact, historically, sort of the percentage of foreign-born in the United States is at its highest level during these decades, right? And so this is fueling a greater attention to the problem of immigration, not just about Asian immigration, but immigration overall. What this graph also does is it disaggregates immigration in terms of sort of major European groups, right? And so by 1880, what has happened is that we have a shift towards many more immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, right? And so there is this shift. This is sort of so overall levels are have greatly increased, and the composition of immigration has also changed significantly, so that by and I'm quoting here from the Dillingham report, in 1907, 81% of the roughly 1.2 million immigrants from Europe were from southern and eastern countries, including Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, Greece, Italy, Montenegro, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Russia, Serbia, Syria, and Turkey. Only 25 years before, in 1882, there had been only about 650,000 European and Syrian immigrants, of whom only about 13% came from the Eastern and Southern European countries listed above, right? And so there's this distinctive shift. And it was perceived, this change was perceived in very negative terms as damaging to the United States. It found that the new immigration has been largely a movement of unskilled laboring men who have come in large part temporarily from the less enlightened and advanced countries of Europe in response to the call for industrial workers in the Eastern and Middle Western states. And of course, this sort of the changing time period also reflects dramatic changes in the US economy and the nature of economic opportunities, not just in terms of who is arriving, right? And so now during this time period between 1880 up to World War I, the largest immigrant populations were Jewish and then Italian, followed by Germans, right? And so Germans happen to be the sort of in the aggregate across US history, the immigrant group that has arrived in the greatest numbers. They've largely disappeared by now, so just their ethnicity is not marked out in the same way. But so there is this mounting sense of crisis targeting Jewish immigrants, Italian immigrants, and as you'll know, I mean, there have been Jewish communities in the United States, well, before the United States became the United States, since colonial times. And so we have established Jewish American communities that then make a decision and undertake to try to moderate, mitigate the impact of potential discrimination, nativism, and immigration regulation against Jewish immigrants. Okay, so here we go. All right, and so this is just a densely informative map, which sort of shows kind of changes in terms of the politics and economies in Europe, and also transportation infrastructure that produces sort of migration from further east and from southern parts of Europe, and sort of the dramatic rise in migration from these areas. There will be significant levels of Jewish migration, and I'm sure most of you here know this history better than I do, particularly after sort of expansion of the Russian Empire and creation of what was called the Pale of Settlement, sort of the singling out of Jewish populations, also many violent attacks, right? And so there is a Jewish population has a very good reason to be on the move in search of new homes. The Jewish migrations to the United States are actually different in character than, say, Italian migrations, in that many of the migrants actually from these other parts of Europe largely come as single men. Many of them are what's called birds of passage. They're sort of looking to work for several years, sort of build up some capital, maybe return to their homelands. This is particularly true of Italian migration. Many of them, in fact, arrive as unskilled workers. This is different from the Jewish migration, which tended to be much more arriving in terms of family units. Many people came with certain kinds of skills and experiences. Nonetheless, face sort of a lot of hostility in the United States. And so this is a representation of some immigrants arriving in 1881, right? And so this time period really sort of high levels and kind of very mixed sorts of perceptions of how the United States should respond. Right, that the United States has historically been able to actually accommodate a lot of immigrants who have made their way, regardless of how sort of the levels of poverty, the amount of struggle needed to try to become more established and stabilized and avoid becoming sort of persons likely to become public charges, right? But the question is being asked, right? And so this is not just being asked about Asian immigrants, but now in the context of New York Harbor, this is Castle Garden, the main immigration depot at this time, before the establishment of Ellis Island. Shouldn't the Uncle Sam take action, right? Look at the simple numbers of people arriving, but then also the traits and attributes associated with them, right? And so in addition to the poverty, non-assimilability, and also another thing that's happening is that earlier generations of immigrants, many of them had managed to move on, settle in the Midwest in rural agricultural undertakings. Many of the newer immigrants were finding themselves ending up in urban centers in industrial employment, very, very famously associated with the so-called ghettos and the tenements of the Lower East Side in New York. The Lower East Side was, I think, had the highest levels of a population concentration in the United States. So highly, highly visible, ethnic communities, language uses, all of these different traits and attributes. So presenting a very visible problem in the United States, right? Also associated with here, so Italians are associated with the mafia, with criminality, but also associated with socialism, radical politics, anarchism, all of this, generating concerns about whether or not the United States could continue to absorb these populations, right? So also, if we go back here, so there is concern not only about the changing composition, but the levels of immigration, right? And the reality is that for the United States to actually significantly reduce immigration, it would actually have to figure out some dividing line, some fault line to reduce immigrants from Europe, right? And this is then the question of what is that dividing line that you draw, and who do you target? How do you draw that dividing line, right? Up to 1892, Europeans have basically not really faced barriers for immigration, right? It's just these attributes of negative characteristics, right? And if you can be identified with these negative characteristics, then you can be debarred. The likely to become public charges criteria mostly was applied against women applying outside, and trying to enter outside of a family group. This movie has, the beginning of it shows the arrival of a single woman arriving. It happens to be Marion Cotillard. Okay, all right, so, but this is a challenge, right? And this is here, so Ellis Island gets established in 1892, and it's processing thousands of immigrants per day, right? And it's, and it is a serious what do you put into the laws, but also what is your process for actually deciding who deserves to get to be an immigrant and who do you have to turn away, right? And so there was a standard list of 29 questions, right? And you can look at it, right? Each immigrant had maybe just a few minutes with each immigration inspector. Most people would arrive, they'd have a very fast medical inspection. They'd be waiting around for some time until they got to speak with an immigration inspector, right? But it's just a couple of minutes, right? And you answer these questions, and then the immigration inspector has to decide whether to admit you or try to send you away, right? And it is clearly unsatisfactory, right? For such a major decision, for such important, not just for the individual immigrant, but also for the nation of the United States, right? And so we will have, across the 1890s, immigration restriction gains legitimation. The Immigration Restriction League will be founded in 1894. The leaders are this group of Harvard alumni, right? And so it becomes a matter taken up by American elites on the grounds that the future of the United States is threatened. The protection of the American form of civilization, if it's to continue to progress, to become stronger and more vital, requires immigration restriction, right? And so they will publish a host of social science studies, right? So sociology, anthropology, these disciplines have their roots are emerging in the 1890s and gaining legitimacy, particularly, and so there will be a critique, right? That the United States is changing direction. These now sort of respectable national leaders were themselves descended from immigrants, who many of them arrive as sort of impoverished, not without high status, but are able to advance, right? And shouldn't the same opportunities be made available to new arrivals? I mean, this is very similar debate to what we are currently still experiencing. Nonetheless, there is at this time also powerful beliefs in racial difference and inequality and incompatibility, right? And at this time, these beliefs in racial difference ascribe racial biological difference to what these days we consider matters of culture or ethnicity, right? But of course, there is this sort of eugenics or the science. Race science is enshrined as being an actual field. And you can see here, eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution, right? There's this tremendous belief that we can manage our population, we can sort of direct our demographics in order to become a stronger race, a stronger culture and civilization. And of course, it's easy to see how immigration policy is one of the areas in which the US government can directly affect and directly improve and try to protect the American population, right? And so this is Harry Laughlin, who headed up the Eugenics Records Office. Harry Laughlin was often consulted by Congress. He was actually consulted by many governments in the world about immigration policy, right? And so I won't go over this board here, right? But this hung in the office. It asked this key question: some people are born to be a burden on the rest, right? Whereas you only have a very few people, 4% of all Americans are of this leadership class that can do creative work and be fit for leadership, right? Clearly, the possibility exists that if you have the right immigration laws, these are the kinds of immigrants who will be selected to come into the United States. Okay, this is just your average person, right? But you also want to avoid and identify people like this, right? So each of these bulbs, these were red light bulbs, they flash at different rates. This was the slowest flashing, this was the quickest flashing. Every 15 seconds, $100 of your money goes for the care of persons with bad heredity, such as the insane, feeble-minded criminals, and other defectives, right? And you want your immigration laws to identify these people who will become burdens on society, right? And of course, we all know that eugenics was used to legitimate sterilization, sort of terrible programs against people considered to be defectives, right? It's sort of a very harsh and cruel system, but this was sort of in the works, right? It was in the atmosphere. And we can see why leaders of the Jewish American community are very eager to try to protect fellow Jews against being labeled in this way, right? Being sort of categorized in ways that had applied to Asians, that might get applied to Jewish persons in terms of immigration restriction, right? And so there is a lot of lobbying. This is a lawyer, Simon Wolf. He really pressed the issue that Jews being Jewish should be understood as a matter of religion, right? Not as a matter of race. Did not want Jews identified as a racial category because this would facilitate being identified for immigration restriction. The American Jewish Committee, also founded in 1906, also paid close attention to the ratcheting up of the drive towards immigration restriction and tried to frame the nature of sort of the definitions and categories that were being produced. Okay, so I should say So the method that the Immigration Restriction League was advocating for a long time as the way to restrict immigration on the basis of quality of people, right? But which was also believed would serve to reduce immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, was a literacy standard. Okay, this will finally get passed in 1917. That actually was the main condition of the 1917 law, but it would take over 2 decades before it actually gets passed. Along the way, there is production of a lot of studies of trying to understand the impact of immigrants, racial and ethnic differences. In 1907, Congress voted to fund the Dillingham Commission, which conducted sort of a very expansive study, right? Apparently, sort of the most expansive study of the U.S. population, also of people's conditions of people coming over to the United States, apart from the U.S. Census. The findings were published in 42 volumes in 1911. This was one of the volumes, the Dictionary of Races or Peoples, and it produces this list, again, compacting a lot of findings and beliefs of sort of different races. So we have the 5 major races of Caucasian, Mongolian, Malay, Ethiopian, American Indian, organized in order of assimilability, right? So the most desirable immigrant populations for the United States actually is at the top, right? And goes all the way down. As the further down you sink, the closer you are to being Mongolian or Malay, who are sort of non-whites, right? The Dictionary of Races or Peoples represents sort of a setback for the American Jewish Committee, because here you see Hebrew is listed as a race, right? And they had tried to combat this. And also sort of very low down in the scale, right? So here we have, Caucasus and Basque peoples are doubtful. But anyways, so there is this undertaking of efforts to categorize and evaluate sort of different groups of people, right, with a view towards how do we actually legislate immigration restrictions so that we can keep out the kinds of people that we don't want, but continue to admit others. And so there is this ongoing struggle. Now, what will happen, in fact, is the literacy test will get passed in 1917. It is enacted over Woodrow Wilson's presidential veto. There will actually, the literacy test will pass several times through Congress, only to be vetoed by a bipartisan succession of presidents who just think a literacy test isn't a real measure, right, of who will be sort of a good immigrant, who will become good Americans. They also just think it sort of reflects too much of a change in US values. Despite projections that the literacy standard would reduce immigration by about 1/3, it doesn't actually have that effect. There is a drop in immigration for a couple of years due to World War I. But once World War I ends, there's a sort of a sharp increase in immigration once again. But something that does happen is this wartime measure. In 1918, this wartime measure changes sort of how immigration laws are enforced, right? And so what it does, it requires arrivals to have passports and visas, right? Meaning that before you come to the United States, you're supposed to go to your the closest US consulate or embassy and get a visa showing that you're pre-approved to arrive, right? So this is a wartime security measure. But I mean, most of us will be familiar that this is actually how we go to other countries in the current period, right? So this is the onset of remote control immigration enforcement. Now, what happens, and so here we can see sort of a year-by-year breakdown in terms of immigration, and we can see the drop because of World War I, but then the steep increase. The steep increase in combination with sort of rising fears of radicalism and spread of communism, especially after the Russian Revolution. You know, there's a series of sort of violent attacks and so we have the Palmer raids in 1919, 1920. Here we have Emma Goldman associated with anarchism. She is stripped of her citizenship. She's deported in 1919. There's just sort of this atmosphere of great urgency around being able to sort of keep out all of these undesirables. Leads Congress to pass this law, 1921 Emergency Quota Law. And it's sort of a blunt instrument, right? And what it does is it imposes a system of national origins quotas. It goes to the 1910 census and it just takes a flat percentage. And it says, okay, if we have, and it's a conservative measure, right? So it's intending to preserve the composition, the demographic composition of the United States. If the United States has sort of a certain number of people from this country, you just take a flat percentage of that population and that creates an immigration quota, right? I think the overall numbers dropped significantly. I think the overall numbers were sort of like 250,000 people, and that's it. That's all the United States can admit in quantitative terms. And then it sort of divvies out those immigration quotas based on national origin, right? This law is immediately effective, right? There's an immediate drop in immigration. It's also more readily enforced because what you start doing is you really require people to have passports and visas, right? So even before people get to the shores of the United States, even before, you sort of have to face the questioning by the immigration inspector, you can be stopped from coming to the United States, right? Before you ever arrive. And this is sort of the system in place now, right? As much as there is sort of this controversy and people being upset about people arriving claiming asylum, there actually are far more people who would actually perhaps might attempt to come to the United States who never get to that point in the first place, right? The Quota Act, the Emergency Quota Act works so well that it's made permanent law in 1924, right? And Congress sets the baseline even further back to 1890. It reduces the percentage down to 2%, right? And so we then enter into this period of sort of extreme immigration restriction, right? And so the numbers just drop precipitously here. Okay, actually, I should show you this. These are the 1924 immigration quotas. I think the total was about 150,000. I may be wrong with that, but about 85% of the the legal visas went to Germany and Great Britain, right? And then also Ireland. Italy experienced the most precipitous decline. So here we see they seem to have a healthy number. It's almost 6,000. But if you consider that prior to this, Italians had come at over like 100,000 per year, right? This is a steep, steep, steep drop. Jewish immigrants sort of escape having this category, right? Oh, I should add the 1924 Act summarily banned immigration by aliens ineligible for citizenship, right? And so just completely applied to all Asian groups. This was openly and deeply offensive to the country of Japan. It seeded the sense of further divide and conflict with the United States. It's often associated with the Japanese decision to bomb Pearl Harbor in 1941. But so if you were Jewish, though, right, there's not a category for you. Jews were coming from many different parts of the world, many different countries. But as a Jewish applicant for entry to the United States, the system of remote control could effectively stop you, right? And so we see this happening. It was especially vivid across the 1930s. Many Jews were trying to come to the United States and could not get their visas approved, right? And so the not necessarily in terms of the law, but in terms of the administrative procedures, then had the effect of significantly reducing Jewish capacities to come to the United States. So this is, anyways, so we could go back and look at this. But so that's basically the end of the talk, right? And There will be a rethinking of US immigration policy and its goals and its implications, especially for foreign relations, international relations with and after World War II, right? But this is how sort of Jews and Asians were positioned as we enter into the period of the severest immigration restrictions in US history. So I'll end there. Should I keep up my PowerPoint? Should I, what should I do? And I probably
whatever you prefer, but please join me in thanking Professor Chu for her lecture. And I think we've got time for questions and answers from her. So we can either choose to raise your hand or and using the raise hands feature under the reactions button on the bottom of your screen. Or if you prefer, you can also use the chat to write your questions in.
Okay, there are some things written in chat. Oh, okay, all right. This is about not being able to see the slides. All right, okay.
So I'll pose a question to get us started. One of the things that struck me is that how really both kind of Asian communities, particularly Japanese communities, were dealing with alongside Jewish communities, dealing with this kind of flexing moves of the immigration structures and immigration restrictions. What would you say is at play? Who had a stronger infrastructure to resist these movements in American society and American governance? And what enabled them to be able to do that more productively than other groups who are also facing similar levels of restriction?
So this is Japan is a emerging international empire, and so Japanese start migrating to the United States in part because of U.S. actions, right? And so it is the U.S. that manages to force Japan to sign the first of unequal treaties, right? Which then leads Japan to undertake the Meiji Restoration and to try to modernize, industrialize, which leads to significant levels of social and economic dislocation, right? It's also American missionaries are going to Japan. This sort of leads to the first groups of Japanese workers who go to Hawaii. There's significant levels of remigration from Hawaii to the U.S. mainland, right? And so there's sort of this bigger picture in terms of how the migration sort of flows and kind of what migration scholars might call grooving, right, gets set up, bringing Japanese to the United States. Although from the Japanese perspective, this was often understood as a form of colonization, of extension. But Japan is very, very successful in terms of its modernization of its military and its economy. And by 1895, it's already starting to claim its own overseas empires, right? And so one of the things that's influencing the United States is this understanding that it can't just sort of shove Japan around. This is one of the considerations is that by, say, 1905, the United States has already acquired the Philippines as a colony, but there actually is an understanding that although the United States is building up its Navy, that Navy, in fact, very likely could not successfully defend the Philippines against Japan, right? And so there is this kind of conflict and tension over influence in the Western Pacific, right? And so even as Californians start agitating for restrictions on Japanese migration, particularly 1904, 1905, 1906, then President Theodore Roosevelt, his Secretary of State Elihu Root, don't want an open breach, right? And there's already, one of the things I'm interested in is the sort of emerging international conventions and understandings about the powers of nation states to regulate immigration, right? And to understand immigration policy also as a key aspect of international relations, right? And so we can see that in the diplomatic negotiations, Japan acknowledges that the United States has the right to try to restrict immigration, right? And that, and Japan accepts that, laborers are not a desirable form of immigrant. At the same time, the United States also understands that the Japanese government does not want its people identified as inferiors and singled out for restriction, right? And so they're able to come to this agreement. It actually is effective, right? And so by and large is carried out. Unlike the Chinese exclusion laws, right, which are so heavily contested and protested, those sort of significant levels of immigration fraud, right, that continue for even decades after the law is repealed in 1943. So my maternal grandfather actually came over using a fraudulent immigration status. But so it's we enter into the very isolationist and hostile 1920s and 1930s, right? And the United States is prepared to undertake this open breach of relations with Japan, right? And after World War II, when the United States has a different set of international relations goals, considerations of international relations, especially in the context of the Cold War, applies a lot of pressure for immigration reform, right? This is one reason why we end up with the 1965 Act, which is, it performs the sleight of hand of actually keeping most people out, but is not couched, does not present things in such a discriminatory way, right? And so if we look at the 1924 immigration quotas, right, as I like to point out, it's a quantification of American prejudice, right? You only have to look at your national number. I mean, if you got a quota at all, and you know exactly what the United States thinks about your country and your people, right? It is openly offensive. In 1952, there is another general immigration bill passed. It is seen as an opportunity for immigration reform, but it retains the national origins quotas, remains highly discriminatory, right? And so this is one of the reasons why LBJ takes up immigration reform in 1965, 64, 65, because he sees it as, he aligns it with his civil rights agenda, right? That you need to have much more egalitarian, less openly discriminatory immigration regulation, right? So there's this, it's also to consider the ways in which immigration policy is subject to, is contingent, right? There's sort of different strategies and different priorities that get applied and then are expressed through the laws that we have. And it's deeply, deeply conflicted because it affects so many aspects of tremendous national interest, right? I mean, you could say national security, you could sort of say, the economy, sort of labor markets, key principles of the United States, right? And many people will deeply, deeply disagree over what should be prioritized or what we're trying to express. So I do not see the United States in the foreseeable future having the kind of general immigration reform that we actually badly, badly need, because it's difficult to forge that kind of consensus. Right. And then also people who are being targeted for immigration restriction are so, vehemently vilified, right? We use very, very sort of nasty ways of depicting the people we want to keep out in order to justify doing so.
It's interesting that, a lot of those cartoons that you showed, and that rhetoric still persists to this day.
Oh, yeah.
So
yeah.
I just want to turn it a little bit to the question that Susie raised in the chat. Susie Seraph raised in the chat, which I think will help bring it back to this question of Jews and Asians together, and particularly in this period that you're charting in your history of kind of late 19th century, early 20th century into this period, is one thing that I never hear talked about is the relationship and mutual perceptions of Asians and Jews in this period. What were the assumptions about Jews in the Asian community, and or the assumptions about Asians in the Jewish community during this period? And so in your work in immigration, do you see any?
I'm trying to think if I've seen direct readings, sort of, or kind of descriptions, right? Discussing differentiation. And I can't remember any accounts, right, where people are sort of writing about, Jews. So sometimes Jews would also be described in the general literature also as Asiatics, right? But one of the things that Chinese American entrepreneurs and also a sort of kind of community leaders are attempting to do is to make this kind of broader pitch, right? And to sort of to move out of being kind of a marginalized and segregated community, right? And so some of this happens through the transformation of intentional transformation of Chinese American communities into Chinatown tourist destinations, right? A broadening out in terms of your customer base for your restaurants and your cuisines, right? And so we see this kind of engagement. So one of the areas in which, it's sort of famous and stereotype is the affinity of Jewish people for Chinese restaurants and food. But there actually was a overt cultivation of this, right? Because there were many Chinese American restaurateurs who in fact sought out the understood and then got the certification of is it halal food, right?
Kosher
And
food.
so what? Kosher, sorry, the wrong term. Okay, so of kosher, sort of meeting kosher standards, right? And so there was this sort of understanding of customer base, right? And then accommodating. Of course, Jewish Americans weren't the only targets for these kinds of accommodations, right? There's sort of other ways in which sort of the food and so your dining experience are kind of adapted to appeal to a broader range of customers, right? But so, yeah.
Yeah, so we've got just, I think, a minute or so more if there are any other questions. So Davida Charney poses in the chat, what did socialism mean in the 19th century?
Okay, so that is outside my area of expertise, right? But they're just I mean, this is from migration studies, right? And we have sort of focused on the lines of restriction and exclusion, right? So what are the kind of the traits and the attributes? A lot of attention has been focused on the racialization of Asians as non-Americans, right? And so this, of course, has been a crucial project in Asian American studies, but we need more attention to other targeted groups, right? And so also, same year, just later in the same year, the 1882 Immigration Act targets persons likely to become public charges, right? And this actually reemerged again in sort of recent actions taken by the Trump administration as justification for sort of denying certain people sort of the being able to move from permanent residence to citizenship as a criteria. But the ways in which sort of U.S. immigration laws reflect this anti-poor sets of values, right? There are people working on there's an 1885 Foran Act, which targeted contract workers, right? What did that mean in practice? How was that actually being worked out, right? We have the addition of polygamists, right? And this had to do with the concerns about Mormons and Utah, anarchists get added in 1903, right? And so, so I have another colleague who is working on sort of immigration restriction and deportation on the basis of politics, right? And this gets ratcheted up with the 1950, 1952 McCarran-Walter Act. There's sort of also the Security Act, right? And so what are the kinds of attributes, characteristics, right, that can get you stripped of your citizenship, for example, can get you detained and deported. And I mean, we focused a lot on race and national origins, but there's actually a much more complex array of discriminations, right? And because there is this sort of this fundamental seeding of so much authority around immigration regulation, right? That it is a source, in fact, of significant kind of inequality and vulnerability for these populations, right? And so there's a lot that has yet to be, I think, worked out in the scholarship.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Chu. And we're grateful for your time. And let's just give one more virtual round of applause. Thank you for so much for a wonderful lecture and a very engaging talk, which I think opened up a lot of vistas for all of us. And it's still percolating with me, both in sort of the contemporary relevance of this period to our current discourse about race and immigration and poverty, but also understanding in more depth the kind of nuances of that period. So thank you so much. We're
Thank
delighted
you.
to have you here, and wish everyone
Good
a
evening.
wonderful evening. Thank you so much.